As Abraham Lincoln's expiring body lay sprawled across a bed on in the hotel across from Ford's Theater, his Secretary of State, Edwin M. Stanton, made the observation, "There lies the greatest ruler of men this world has ever seen." In many ways, his assessment of Lincoln was very apropos regarding the nature of a nation which Lincoln began to lead, the turmoil that arose during his presidency, and the leadership that he supplied, and his view not only of the North but also of the South, and his endeavoring to bring a nation back together. What does it take to make a great leader? Romans 13, God rules, and the powers that be are ordained of God. Yes, there are times when God appoints the leaders wherein the righteous get what they need. There are times when God ordains leaders wherein the unrighteous and rebellious get what they deserve. A case can be made simply looking through the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, and the writings of Moses, that God appointed leaders when He appointed Noah with the work that he did, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And yes, God's leaders can be seen in Moses, Joshua, the judges, David, Solomon. Then there are those leaders that God appointed that would actually be detrimental to those they led. Pharaoh, Abimelech in the period of Judges, Saul, Jeroboam, the first ruler of the northern kingdom of Israel, Nebuchadnezzar, that ruler of Babylon, various figures in biblical history whose leadership was less than stellar and detrimental to so many. Noah, Abraham, even those that led with a righteous inclination were fallible. Yet God was able to utilize them. Ultimately, they glorified God. Of those leaders that God appointed that were endeavoring to follow His will, perhaps none are identified so clearly in terms of the reason they were selected as is David. Acts 13:22, Paul, looking back over Israel's history, regarded the leadership that they had previously had and noted that when God appointed David, he said, "I have seen David, the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart, who shall do according to my will." God chose David with purpose. Why? Well, a man after my own heart would do according to my will. Those were the same words that Samuel used in speaking with Saul, 1 Samuel 13:14. Or you think about what Samuel would tell Saul on a later occasion when Saul had rebelled against God by failing to carry out the full command regarding the Amalekites and the war with them. 1 Samuel 15, picking up at verse 28, Saul would hear from the words of Samuel, "God has chosen your neighbor who's better than you." An idea that we investigated last Sunday afternoon. And then when Samuel was instructed by God to go to the house of Jesse and ordain one of Jesse's sons to be king, God told Samuel, "Don't look on this oldest one. Man looks on the outward appearance. God looks on the heart. God doesn't see as man sees." God had chosen David not because of outward appearance, but because of his heart. But the question still lingers, why? Why was David better than Saul? What was it about David's heart that made him suited for leadership? What does it mean to be a man after God's own heart? Let's note some things it doesn't mean, just briefly. For one thing, it doesn't mean sinless because David was not. David committed sin with Bathsheba and sins subsequently regarding that situation. David committed sin whenever he ordained for the nation to be numbered, contrary to God's will, 2 Samuel 24. A man after God's own heart doesn't mean sinless. And it doesn't mean he could read God's mind. 2 Samuel 7, David said, "I'm going to build a house for God." Nathan said, "You do what's according to your heart." God said, "No, you don't." David had good intentions. But even with the best of intentions, he was not reading God's mind. David had been consumed with war because it was necessary during the time of his reign, but because of that, he would not be able to build that house that he so desired to build. It doesn't mean he was sinless. Being after God's own heart doesn't mean he could read God's mind, nor does being a man after God's own heart mean that David was fearless. There are times that he fled. He fled from Saul. He feigned insanity out of fear of the Philistine king. It doesn't mean he was fearless. It doesn't mean he was sinless. It doesn't mean that he could read God's mind. And contrary to what's so often said, it doesn't just mean he was penitent. David's penitence was because of wrong. God doesn't repent of wrong. Now, while penitence is going to be connected to this attribute of David, the fact that he would repent is not the sole quality that makes him a man after God's own heart. There's more to it. Every time this idea is mentioned, it's connected to the idea of leadership. Now, the greatest leaders that the world has ever seen, there lies the greatest ruler of men the world has ever seen. If those words can even begin to be spoken with hyperbole about an individual, it's going to be that person possesses a quality that David possessed. A man after God's own heart. Consider the state of the nation when David began to rule. David began ruling at a time when the former king had been disgraced. Died by his own sword, died in defeat, died in a battle with their enemies, and really at the lowest point of his reign. David began ruling a nation that was disgraced at the throne. He began ruling a nation that was divided among the tribes. Yes, Judah and Simeon would follow David, but the rest followed Ishbosheth for a period of time. David began ruling a nation that was disgraced, that was divided, and that was distant from God. The comment is made 1 Chronicles 13:3 that they had not inquired at the ark of God during the time of Saul. That's the state of the nation when David begins to reign. That's going to be relevant as we move forward. For now, questions to ask. What kind of leaders are we electing? What kind of leaders are we expecting? What kind of leaders are we becoming? What kind of leaders are we developing? Are we endeavoring to develop men after God's own heart in every facet and aspect of life? People need leaders like the leader David was. People need leaders who follow with a steadfast heart. Acts 13:22, I found David, the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart, who will do according to my will. David, being a man after God's own heart, is very much connected to him doing God's will, to him following God's lead. David, being a man after God's own heart, describes first and foremost how David followed. As a leader, David followed. Time and again, as history looked back over the life of David following his reign, 1 Kings 3:6, he said to have walked with uprightness of heart. 1 Kings 9:4, integrity of heart. But there's a description given 1 Kings 14:8. When God compares David with subsequent rulers, he says that David followed me with all of his heart, according to that which I commanded him. God assessed David's reign as following him fully, entirely, completely, sincerely. David followed God's lead to the point that he's described in 1 Kings 11:4 and 1 Kings 15:3 as having a perfect heart. That doesn't mean he was sinless, but he had a heart that truly endeavored to stay right with God. Fervent, sincere desire to follow God and to do what God deems right. We need leaders who follow with a steadfast heart. David's heart was faithful. Were there times when he struggled? Absolutely. His heart was faithful, steadfast, but not only in following God. He followed God's lead. But to lead like David also involves following God's leaders. Remember the relationship that he had with Saul, his predecessor. Saul, upon realizing that David was the one that was better than him, began endeavoring to take David's life. Various times he tried to turn David into a target as he hurled the javelin. Multiple times he pursued after David through the regions of Judea and really coming near to the border of the Philistines until David essentially decided that he needed to spend time outside of Israel for his own safety. On one occasion, David has Saul right where any rebellious man would want him, in a cave, where David could actually take Saul's life. David's approach to Saul, 1 Samuel 24:10, I'll not reach forth my hand against the Lord's anointed. David saw Saul as God's appointed leader, and as such, even when Saul was wrong, David was not going to engage in an act of rebellion. He would administer correction. And he would administer correction in a way that pleaded with Saul publicly, openly, and at the same time elevated Saul and gave Saul as good of a reputation as could possibly be given. David operated with the utmost respect as he followed not only God's lead, but God's leaders. He would do that as he interacted with Saul on that occasion, 1 Samuel 24, later 1 Samuel 26, when Saul is again pursuing David. David sneaks into the camp while Saul is asleep, takes a spear and a cruse of water, and then calls back and indicates, here's how close I was. There was one that said, take your life, but I won't put forth my hand against the Lord's anointed. David had a respect for God's appointed leadership. Here's why it's relevant. Great leaders are first and foremost great followers. There may have been conquerors in human history that weren't good followers, but there have never been leaders who were not good followers. Being able to lead demands that one be able to follow. Consider David's reaction when news came of Saul's death. 2 Samuel, chapter 1, the Amalekite came and said, I found Saul. He was leaning on his sword, but he was still alive. The Philistines were close upon pursuing him, and he asked me to take his life. I did. David knew that this man was telling a story in order to gain reward, but at the same time, he gave an open confession saying, I assassinated your king. And as a result, David would punish that individual, 2 Samuel 1:14 through 16, because he had put forth his hand against the Lord's anointed. David had such a respect for God's appointed leadership that he recognized that act as a violation. And then there's 2 Samuel 1, beginning in verse 17, when he lamented with a lamentation concerning Saul and Jonathan, the man that had put David on the run for years. And David writes a funeral dirge to honor, to say how the mighty have fallen. Hey, Christians, let's just bring this one right down to where we can apply it first and foremost to the church. Is it possible that leaders in the church will make mistakes? Absolutely. Is it possible that elders will make mistakes? Yes. Deacons, Bible class teachers, preachers, expect it. How are we going to treat them? How are we going to act and react? How are we going to approach those that are endeavoring to perform roles that God has either given by biblical mandate or that exist by expediency? Are we going to approach those roles with the same kind of honor that expects the utmost integrity of those that will fill the role, but also extends the utmost humility whenever mistakes are made, whenever blunders are committed? How are we going to treat them? Great leaders are first and foremost great followers. And if we would ever be suited to be leaders in the Lord's church in any capacity, we must first be able to be followers in any capacity. We can apply this also to the nation. Now, this is going to be sobering. This is not a pretty picture. But until we have leaders that are suitable followers, they will never truly be great leaders. Makes me a bit pessimistic concerning the options before us. How about you? When there's too much arrogance to know how to follow, that leader may be a conqueror. That leader may accomplish this or that. But a great leader, per God's standard, such will not be. So, people need leaders who follow with a steadfast heart, the kind that follow God's lead, the kind that follow God's leadership. Yes, David made mistakes. David had errors, but 1 Kings 15:5, the assessment is made concerning David that in all things he followed God with a perfect heart, except in the matter of Uriah. That was Bathsheba's husband. Yes, there's a blemish on David's record as it pertains to that episode with Bathsheba and that scandal regarding her husband. There was a time when David stumbled. Yet God was still willing to look at David as someone that followed him wholeheartedly. And if God will look at David that way, first, shouldn't we? Second, how do we look at each other? Do we expect more perfection from each other than God expected from David? Or are we willing to look at each other with the same kind of grace, the same kind of patience that God used with the man that was after his own heart? So, people need leaders who first and foremost follow with a steadfast heart, but also who lead with a shepherd's heart. Acts 13:22, Paul is talking about God's appointed leaders. And man after mine own heart is the stipulation or criteria that God utilized in describing why David was to be a leader, to be king. 1 Kings 13:14. When Samuel told Saul, God has sought him a man after his own heart to be captain of his people. It's stated in the context of leadership. It's not simply about the integrity and pureness of David's heart, and it's not only about David's desire to follow God. Please hear that repeated. David being a man after God's own heart includes the idea of the integrity of his heart and his desire to follow after God, but it goes further than that. Because there are many people that desire to follow God wholeheartedly, but they just ain't good leaders. David was. What's the difference? At this point, it's worth investigating Psalm 78. Psalm 78 is a bit of a review of Israel's history. It actually begins as a historic psalm giving reminders of where they've been and what they've done. God's interaction with the people, their rebellion against Him, God's treatment of them, God's treatment of their enemies, and it ends with God appointing David as king. A key thrust in Psalm 78 is God's patient leadership of the people. To the point that Psalm 78:38, He was full of compassion. He forgave their iniquity, destroyed them not. Many a times He turned His anger away and did not stir up all His wrath. God was patient with them. That's the kind of leadership that God gave to the people that He brought out of Egypt, that He guided through the wilderness, that He brought into the land, and all along the way they murmured, complained, and rebelled at various points. And then another assessment of God's leadership is given, Psalm 78, verse 52. He made his own people to go forth like sheep, and He guided them in the wilderness like a flock. God's patient leadership of His people was like a shepherd leads his flock. And that is the very behavior of God being exhibited throughout the psalm. Now notice how the psalm closes. Picking up at verse 70, He chose David, also His servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. God chose David, and He took him from following out after those ewes great with young, those big pregnant female sheep. God took David from taking care of them, and He brought him to feed Jacob His people and Israel His inheritance. God, who led His people like a shepherd, chose a shepherd to come lead his people. Psalm 78:72. So he fed them. The word translated fed is shepherded. He, David, shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart. David led them like a shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for his sheep. The shepherd knows his sheep and is known of his sheep. The shepherd does not lead sheep like some sort of general over faceless military. A shepherd leads his sheep knowing each one by name. A relationship with each one. David was called to lead Israel like a shepherd leads sheep. He fed them according to the integrity of his heart, guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. A leader like David has the integrity of a shepherd, the uprightness of heart of a shepherd, and the perspective of those that he leads like a shepherd. David guided. He led the very way that God had led them. Isn't it interesting that God is not only described as shepherding Israel in their previous history, Psalm 78:52, but glance over at Psalm 80, verse 1. Give ear, O shepherd of Israel. That's how God's described. And how could we forget Psalm 23? The Lord is my shepherd. The Lord, the shepherd, chose a shepherd to lead. Now, take that thought and move it forward just a little bit more to how it manifests in David's leadership. Because not only did David lead with the integrity of a shepherd, but he did so with the identity of a shepherd. Shepherd shows in every mile marker along the way in David's life. Where was David when Samuel went to anoint him as king? He wasn't gathered for the feast because he was out shepherding the flock, 1 Samuel 16:11. And after he was anointed, Saul begins experiencing mental instability. An evil spirit from the Lord has Saul troubled and paranoid. And Saul asks for someone to come and play for him, and they say, "We found a man named David." And when Saul sent for David to come and play for him, 1 Samuel 16:19, he asked Jesse to send me David who is with the sheep. Not only did they describe David to Saul as one who could play really well, he's a shepherd. 1 Samuel 17. Usually we think of David, and it's not long before we mention David and Goliath. When David fought Goliath, he did not use the armor of a soldier. He had not tried that sort of equipment. When David went up against Goliath, he had been called from following with the sheep earlier in the chapter, and he comes to visit his brothers at his father's behest, and he hears the threats of the Philistine, and he decides he will not stand for someone deriding the armies of the living God. And when he goes out against Goliath, what does he take? Notice, if you will, 1 Samuel 17, picking up at verse 39, David chooses the tools of a shepherd. David girded his sword upon his armor. He essayed to go. He wouldn't take it. He wouldn't prove it. He said, "I can't go with these." Verse 40, he took his staff in his hand. That's a shepherd's staff. He took him 5 smooth stones from the brook, and he put them in his shepherd's bag, which he had, and his sling was in his hand. He's using the tools of a shepherd. From the time that David was called, he was a shepherd. Whenever David made his name, so to speak, by fighting with Goliath, he used the tools of a shepherd. And then after the death of Saul, whenever Israel ultimately realizes we are to be following David, and they come to David for him to lead them, notice, if you will, 2 Samuel 5. Because Israel comes to David, all the elders of Israel, and according to verse 2, they say, "You were the one that led us out. You brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, David, we know that God has said, 'Thou shalt feed, shepherd my people Israel.'" Even the nation knew that God had called David to be a shepherd for them. later in his life, when he errantly numbered the people, an error that would cost many lives in the nation. God would send a plague, a pestilence. David's petition regarding the situation for God to spare the people included the following words. Please hear them. 2 Samuel 24:17, I have sinned, but these sheep, what have they done? David saw those that were suffering for his mistake as sheep that were suffering because of the error of their shepherd. Or then the most sordid event in David's life pertaining to Bathsheba. David, in some sort of blind denial, fails to realize the gravity of what he's done until the prophet comes and explains to him the situation with the parable made for a shepherd. There was a man who had a ewe lamb. He treated her like a daughter, but then a rich man beside him had a guest arrive, and instead of using his own, he took the ewe lamb and served her. David's reaction to hearing someone abuse such a situation is, he shall surely die. Thou art the man. David failed to see the hypocrisy of his behavior until it was presented to him with a parable custom suited for a shepherd. What's the point? Simply this. The fact that David was a man after God's own heart included the way he followed God sincerely, yes, but also the way that he looked at the ones that he led. He looked at them with the same compassion, the same sentiment, the same desire to protect, the same nurture and feeding inclination as a shepherd for a sheep. That's going to be important to remember when we start talking about leadership today. When it comes to those that would be leaders in the church, ultimately in the local congregation, those that have the oversight are called shepherds. They are to feed the flock, Acts 20:38. They are to shepherd the flock, as Peter would put it, 1 Peter 5. The shepherds, the elders, they're called to lead, to feed, to nurture, and to care for the flock with the same sort of terminology that God used in appointing David. You realize that means that those that would be leaders in the church need to be men after God's own heart, endeavoring to follow Him with perfect hearts fully and looking at His people the way God does. A final consideration. People need leaders who will follow with a steadfast heart, who will lead with a shepherd's heart, but finally, who will rule with a sympathetic heart. What do we mean by that? Notice a statement David makes at the end of his rule, or at least that's where it's recorded. 2 Samuel 23, this is just one chapter before the close of 2 Samuel, and we're nearing the end of David's life. And the words are recorded, the Spirit of the Lord spake by me, His word was in my tongue. The Spirit of the Lord, the God of Israel said, the Rock of Israel spake, He that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. David, here's how you are to lead. Here's how you are to rule. Anyone that would exercise authority over men is to exercise justice, that's fairness, and fear of the Lord, a proper fear, respect for God. He needs a heart for justice. But also, this idea of justice is going to permeate so much of what Solomon would write, so would the idea of fear of the Lord. Proverbs 28:16, Solomon would make the observation that the prince that lacks understanding is also a great oppressor. Understanding being the ability to see things from another's point of view. The leader that doesn't see things from another's point of view is a great oppressor. God expects leadership that is just and that is understanding. Now take that thought and recall the nation's needs when David first began to reign. because he needed to understand their needs. They had a disgraced king. Saul's body had been desecrated. He had taken his own life. How does David begin to rule? First, he punishes the one that claims to have killed Saul. But then he writes a funeral dirge that spread throughout the nation. A funeral dirge that still remains today. And that serves as a guide for any eulogy in looking for the good words to say about one, even when the one that's passed wasn't exactly perfect. David helped the nation to honor and lament over Saul. The nation also had a division problem. David helped the nation to heal. It's interesting, there was conflict between the house of David and the house of Saul, Saul's descendants, Ishbosheth. But this war was more of a tension than ongoing fighting. There's one battle recorded, and it's more of a skirmish than anything. And so a lasting tension will go for some 7 years. But isn't it interesting that as David grew stronger and stronger, at no point did he decide we're going to go and slaughter the other side so that we can take them by force. David waited patiently. And then, as events unfolded, and news came of the assassination of Ishbosheth, David demanded the punishment and execution of those that had assassinated the one that was seen as his rival. David demonstrated to the nation that he was worried about the overall well-being of the nation, not just his position. He gave the nation healing in the way that he approached every aspect of it. And when the people came to him and recognized him as king, 2 Samuel chapter 5, yes, they did so willingly, knowing that he had been looking after their benefit the entire time. He gave them honor and lamentation. He gave them healing and unification. And remember, they were distant from God. Having not petitioned at the of the ark of the Lord, David has the ark brought to Jerusalem. Oh, there's a learning curve involved there, 2 Samuel 6. But then 2 Samuel 7, he wants to build a house for God. He wants to make sure that Israel knows that God is the center of their identity. David is pointing them, as his rule begins and as it moves forward, not to his throne, but to their God. Now, consider, if you will, the summary statement given of David's rule after his throne is established. 2 Samuel 8:15, David reigned over all Israel. Whereas the previous verse says the Lord preserved David everywhere he went. David reigned over all Israel, and he executed judgment and justice unto all his people. David, the ruler of men, must be just. He was. Operating in the fear of the Lord, he did. When David began to rule, he looked to the people's needs, and he saw exactly that. Nationally, do we have similar needs? Do we live in a society that sees disgrace at the highest levels of government? Do we live in a society that sees division at every level of society? And do we live in a society that's distant from God? What's needed beyond all else is leadership that steers a nation toward God, that seeks to heal rifts, overcome difficulties, and that will find a way to honor the past without honoring that which is dishonorable. Do we seek that in elected officials? Or do we seek those that just perpetuate dishonor, perpetuate division? And do we seek to elect those that will perpetuate a distance from God instead of pointing a nation toward the God of all nations? Or we can apply it to the church as well. We can apply it to the home. When it comes to leadership, are we looking to strengthen the home by getting rid of any division and hardship? Strengthen the church by overcoming the same? Are we looking to overcome whatever smears and smudges and scandals might be hindering the church's reputation? Do we overcome those, and do we point the entire body, whether it be the home, whether it be the church, toward our God? David, if you think of him as anything, think of him as a shepherd, because everything else he did stemmed from that. Isn't it interesting that centuries later, when Ezekiel foretells of the one that will rule God's people, Ezekiel 37:24, he said, David the king shall rule the people. They shall have one shepherd. Ezekiel's looking forward to the Christ. Described this descendant of David as the shepherd. Jesus, the good shepherd. Jesus, that great shepherd of our souls, 1 Peter 2:25. Now, we need great leadership. We need great leadership in the home. We need great leadership in the church. We need great leadership in the nation. But please remember that great leadership comes first from those that follow. We've sang the song already today, who will follow Jesus? The question would be, are we? Are we following Him with all sincerity, with all intent, with all submission? Maybe it's the case this afternoon that you've had a respect and an honor for the Lord, but you've not been following with a whole heart. Maybe it's the case that you, like David, have a smudge, and it's time to repent. Maybe it's the case that it's simply time to come to Him for the first time. Maybe you've never been baptized in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, and you're ready to be washed. Maybe you're a child of God and you've wandered far away, but it's time to come home. Whatever the case, if you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we hope you'll take the opportunity while we stand and while we sing.